Okay. Hello, everybody. It's great to see so many familiar faces. Good afternoon to you all from Boston. Welcome to the Decolonization in Progress seminar. And today is our very first meeting of fall 2021. So this is very exciting and a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm your host and moderator. My name is Jayita Sarkar. I'm an assistant professor here at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, and I direct the Global Decolonization Initiative that is hosting this event. Today, we are thrilled to host Dr. Jessica Namakkal, who is the author of this truly excellent book, Unsettling, Utopia, The Making and Unmaking of French India. And it was published earlier this year by Columbia University Press. Before I proceed any further, I think most of us know everything about Zoom, but let me still get it out of the way that this meeting is being recorded. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please mute your audios and turn off your videos. Also during the Q&A, if you do not wish to be recorded, send us your questions through chat, and we will try our best to get to you as time permits. So let me begin by introducing our panelists in the order in which they will speak. We have first our author, Dr. Jessica Namakkal, who is an associate professor of the practice of international comparative studies at Duke University. Dr. Namakkal is part of the editorial collective of the Radical History Review. She is the author, as I said, of this truly excellent book, Unsettling, Utopia, published by Columbia University Press, for which we are here today. Our next panelist is Dr. Kalyani Ramnath, who is a Prize Fellow at Harvard University, and she's a historian of modern South Asia. Her expertise is in legal history with an emphasis on questions of law and empire, labor and immigration histories, and methodological approaches to comparative, connected, and transnational histories. We will be soon joined, I assure you, by Dr. Andrew Smith, who is joining us from the UK, and he is a reader in contemporary history and politics at the University of Chichester. Dr. Smith is a historian of French and the Francophone world with an interest in identities beyond the frame of the nation state. He's the author of Terror and Terroir, the Wine Growers of the Languedoc and Modern France, published by Manchester University Press in 2016. As for me, I'll keep my comments very short and I'll really let the other panelists talk more. But as you heard, I'm an assistant professor here at Boston University, and I teach courses on 20th century history and global South Asia. And my first book, Plowshares and Swords, India's nuclear program in the global Cold War, will be published next year with Cornell University Press. So without further ado, I welcome you all. Welcome to all the panelists. Welcome to all the attendees. And with that, I pass it over to our author, Dr. Namakkal. The floor is yours.
Okay, can people see that? Okay, so I love this picture, and I would have used this for the cover, except it's from the Hindu, and you can just never get rights to publish anything from the Hindu. So instead, I have one lonely police officer standing at the pebble border in a village between India and French India. And this picture actually serves as a great contrast, because what you see here is a lot of people standing on a border between Pondicherry and India. And this is in 1952. And I want to start with this to just show that there was actually a massive amount of people that were affected by the borders in French India. And you can see how they showed up, right? Even though sort of the histories that we hear and tell make it seem like this was very passive for most of the people that were living in these spaces. So the time is also important. And by looking at French India, what I suggest is that it shifts our understanding about the space and time of both colonialism and decolonization in South Asia and for France. So 1952 is, of course, after 1947, which I don't think I need to rehearse for anybody. And, you know, the story goes that when France began to understand that India was going to be liberated, was going to gain independence in 1947, you know, they started thinking about what relinquishing the French Indian territories would mean for the rest of their empire. You know, Pondicherry and, oh, actually, yeah, there we go. There's the other colonies, the other territories they were never important in terms of sort of military reasons. From 1814, none of the French Indian territories were allowed to have any military presence. They could have a police force, but that was it. And they were really sort of under the watch of England in that, since they had lost these territories. And so they were sort of seen as a cultural, of being of great cultural importance, right? Because India was such an important space to have influence and to have a cultural spot. I mean, it was also a really important space for them because it was a space where they could sort of show how their colonial style was different than the British colonial style, right? So they used it as a place to show what good imperialists they were, right? And some of this is reflected in the citizenship opportunities that were available to people living in French India in the late 19th century, but even earlier, when people of the French Revolution who lived in French India were writing letters to Paris, right, to be included in the revolution. So there is this, you know, it's a small population in these French Indian territories, but there is a strong attachment to an idea of a Frenchness. That's in there and actually still really persists today. So that's one of the reasons that these territories remained important to France, but also if they had given them up, right? And this is actually where we get the language of decolonization for the French, is that diplomats are talking about it, bureaucrats are talking about it in the colonial offices of what would it mean to have to decolonize a part of the French Empire, right? Because you had uprisings in Algeria, you had nationalist uprisings in Madagascar. Of course, 1954 is the big moment for Indochina, and we're getting to that point. But so this was actually a big question for the French. So, you know, it becomes a little bit of a laboratory for them to try out what might happen in the rest of the empire. So that date there, 1952, remains really important because it's sort of this midway point. It's 5 years after Indian independence. It's several years after 2 years after the Indian Constitution was put into place, right? And it'll be another 2 years before the French agree to leave. And there's a lot going on during that time period. It's in the book. But it is important in terms of the timeline of French Empire that 1954 is the year that they lose Indochina, right? And Indochina is the closest French territory to Pondicherry. And there's a lot of people from French India that live in Indochina. So that there's a lot to think about there. So November 1st, right, 2 days ago, is in Pondicherry is recognized as Puducherry. It changed its name a few years ago, Puducherry Liberation Day. Right, and what you're seeing here is actually where the treaty was signed, and a little sign about it, a place of remembrance. And this date is really interesting and important because within the Indian national calendar, Pondicherry Independence Day is August 16th, 1962. But people locally recognize November 1st, 1954 as the date of liberation. So there's some discussion there about what that means. And what happened in terms of the French Empire is that France agrees to leave in 1954. 2 years later in 1956, that treaty is accepted and Nehru signs off on it. And then it's not until 1962 when they lose Algeria, they work it into the Amiens Accords that they will finally leave French India. So 1962 is the year where people have to decide if they're going to be French citizens or Indian citizens. So there's this real gray period, right, of belonging there. So time and space. And the other thing I want to talk about is scale, right? So as you see from these, well, let's see, let me go back to this map for a second. If you zoom in on the Pondicherry map, you'll notice that there's these black spaces and then the gray spaces. And the black spaces are the French areas, and then the gray spaces were the spaces of British India and, as of 1947, India. So those borders just transfer right over into India. So you always had these fractured borders within Pondicherry. And there were actually fences built in the 1930s. There were customs agents put to work in these border towns, and they became real markers of geographic markers of belonging and enclosure in a lot of ways. Okay, so to go on with scale a little bit, the other thing, and this is what Pondicherry became famous for in the early 20th century, was as the home of the Aurobindo ashram. So again, there's a lot of history to go over there, but two things. One, the map you're looking at is a map of this of Pondicherry, and below the blue line, which is a canal, a sewage canal, you see what was until very recently called White Town, and they have changed it quite recently to Heritage Town. So that's what you'll find on the maps there, but it's the same space. And then the rest of it was called Blacktown. Right, so underneath that canal is where you found, if you go there today, right, you'll see the buildings where you're like, oh, is this Saigon? Is this New Orleans? It's French architecture, French colonial architecture. It's on the Bay of Bengal, right? It's seafront property. And from about the time of the early 1920s, a lot of this land was owned by the Aurobindo ashram. I'm going a little bit backwards here, but to give you a sense of sort of how the city is divided up, it was segregated quite early. The importance of the ashram, Sri Aurobindo, was a widely renowned Bengali freedom fighter who goes to Pondicherry in 1910 to escape persecution by the British police. He was wanted in a bombing case. So he escapes to Pondicherry, and he spends the rest of his life there. The woman that you see him with here is the mother, Mira Alfassa, born Mira Alfassa, a French woman, whose parents were Sephardic Jewish people and had come from Egypt and Turkey, but raised her sort of as a secular person in Paris. And she is a spiritualist. She's interested in the occult. She has lots of associations with theosophy, and some other spiritualist groups, some that were located in French-occupied Algeria at the time. And it comes to Pondicherry with her husband at the time, Paul Richard, who was employed by the French government, and they were sent to Pondicherry. They were both very interested in Sri Aurobindo, who had become known by the time she got there in 1914 for his sort of spiritual thought. I just want to take a quick second actually to say, I've noticed more and more that outside of, there's one very good biography of Aurobindo, The Lives of Sri Aurobindo by Peter Heese. But outside of that, when even people who are critical of spirituality and things like this, even his life is really divided into political Sri Aurobindo and philosophical Sri Aurobindo, right? There's not a lot of thinking across that boundary. And so one of my arguments in the book, right, is that the very fact that Aurobindo and the mother come together and start this ashram is in many ways a political act. It's one of ownership, of property ownership. It's one of bringing new populations into this area. It brings me to one of the other points in my book, and one that I've really thought about and have been people have asked me about since the book came out, which is that it is possible to be anti-colonial and colonial at the same time, right? And so how do we sort of rectify that tension, right? Aurobindo, incredibly celebrated still for being an anti-British freedom fighter, right? And it's not that he was he wasn't a French nationalist. He wasn't suggesting that Pondicherry should be French. But what happened with him and the mother is they really sort of said, the ashram's an apolitical body. We're not, everybody deserves a chance at sovereignty, but, we're not going to intervene in the affairs of the French administration. Meanwhile, right, the mother's brother is actually a French colonial governor in Congo. The French bureaucrats all really like the mother and Aurobindo, and everything they want to know about Pondicherry and the struggles against the French in Pondicherry, they sort of go to the ashram, right, to get information and to feel. So there's certainly these political alliances that are there. And then for the people in Pondicherry, this is the richest organization in town, right? So there is certainly something to think about there. Okay, I know I need to keep these brief, so I won't go through all of these. But you know, just thinking about maps and divisions and scales, Pondicherry is such a fractured space. Yet after independence, and actually after Aurobindo passes away in 1950, the mother becomes really devoted to putting up this map of what she calls a spiritual map of India, which, you know, includes, you know, Sri Lanka in there. If you look at it, all of the places. So, you know, it is actually like, this is a political map, right? This is a statement that she's making. You can see her in front of the map of Nehru here, right? And you have that's the mother's symbol and becomes the symbol of the ashram that you see on the center of the map there, right? So this is a statement that she's really devoted to about sort of understanding the roots of what she thinks is a organic spirituality imbued within the territory of what she considers to be undivided India, right? And this becomes really important when we're thinking about territory and land and how you can be colonial and anti-colonial at the same time, right? Because the next project, well, actually I have a quote from her on this that I will show quick, right? You know, the mother was quite attached to her Frenchness, but really saw herself also as a spiritualist attached to the territory, to the land of India. So here's a quote from her from 1954. August 15th is not only Indian Independence Day, it's Sri Aurobindo's birthday. Go figure. So she makes this claim then. Although I am French by birth, India is my true country, the country of my soul and my spirit. Spiritually, I am Indian. I hope I shall be allowed to adopt the double nationality, that is to say, to remain French while I become an Indian. And I like to highlight this quote because it really shows the great divide between what people who were French Indians, people in French India, were dealing with being sort of asked whether they were going to be Indians in the post-colonial world or they were going to be French. Well, you had this woman who had come and made a life for herself and gotten a lot of fame and followers by coming to Pondicherry, actually lobbying the newly formed Indian government for dual citizenship. The ashram has a campaign where they write letters, right, saying we should be allowed to be dual citizens, right? So this idea of sort of being able to be in both spaces because of a spiritual attachment is really important to this project. And that lends over to the last point I will make in this talk anyway, which is something that in the book I call settler utopianism. And I use this to theorize a little bit the ashram, but really what comes out of that, which is this utopian intentional community called Oroville, which is located right outside Pondicherry. Although so most of the land of Oroville is actually in Tamil Nadu. It's not in the Union Territory of Pondicherry, although there is some overlap. So some of the land today is in Puducherry's territory. So if you look at Google Maps, you can actually see this. So this term settler utopianism that I sort of think about in the book, it draws on work in settler colonial studies and thinking about the project of settler colonialism, not to use this case as comparative and not to call India a settler colony, but in fact to say that the people that are coming to Oroville are coming from places like Australia and Canada and the United States and the UK, where settler colonialism is a narrative that is celebrated, right, and put into practice. So it's part of the global project of settler colonialism, right? People are drawing on the same narratives. They're calling themselves pioneers, right? They're seeing, when they get to India, they're seeing empty land that needs to be reforested, is the word they like to use. It needs to be saved from the local people and itself, right? And it's imbued again, it's given sort of a pass on a lot of its projects because it is imbued in these spiritual terms. So just to give you an example of this, this is a panel that's up in the Oroville Visitors Center. Last time I was there was 2016, and I took this picture then, right? And you have these people working there, and it says, research through experience of the supreme truth, a life divine, but no religion. Oroville is for those who want to do the yoga of work. And then you have all of these narratives from the people that were coming, probably the people in these pictures, right? where people are saying, you got there, it was so hard, you had to hire people from the local villages to do all the work, right? We've got there, and so the mother's line was sort of, to be an Orovillean, you need to believe in the divine, which is this power, and you also need to actually do the work. And it's actually just countless. I'm gonna skip this one actually, but it's just countless the way people talk about, they do it all the time, but it's shameless. There's no self-reflection, right? There's like, yeah, I came, and really we had to get these people to do all the work for us. So this guy is a guy who's still in Oroville, and he actually comes from the Johnny Walker fortune from Australia, right? And what has really happened in Oroville, and I will stop here because I know I'm taking up a lot of time. What has happened is it's become a very sort of successful space in terms of industry, where you have people not just from these places I mentioned, but from all over India, sort of coming to Oroville and starting these small scale fashion houses, incense places. They make the mother toothpaste, which I found at my local supermarket recently. So it's actually been very successful in that sense. And it's kind of turned into a development project, right? Where they're employing local women who would be in poverty otherwise, right? Without ever acknowledging the infrastructure that was put into place to keep them from using the land themselves, right? So my overall argument about this in the book, right, is that settler utopianism is a way that colonialism has continued to shape the everyday life in this region, and especially when it comes to sort of ideas about what it means to be a global citizen, what it means to understand the past, right, and what colonial history is. So I will stop there. That's just an overview of some.
That was an excellent summary of your truly splendid book. We now turn it over to Dr. Ramnath for her comments on the book. Dr. Ramnath, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Jay, for this invitation. And thank you, Jayita and Andrew and Jay, for this wonderful conversation. Already it's proving to be sort of, my brain is sparking with all kinds of insights. Jayita, your summary also provided sort of really neat extensions of your argument that I think I'm going to be thinking with for a long time. So thank you for that. I've had the great privilege and pleasure of having some of these conversations with Jayita previously as well. So I'm delighted to be able to continue that today. What I'll be doing is coming to Unsettling Utopia from the perspective of someone writing at the intersection of global history, migration and citizenship studies, and sort of connected histories with a focus on South and Southeast Asia. Let me get to the punchline straight away. So Unsettling Utopia offers readers and scholars a fascinating way of thinking through the age of decolonization through carceral borders, post-colonial citizenships in the plural, and political untethering. It takes state-led efforts at decolonization seriously, not treating it merely as a metaphor, but importantly also points to why a decolonial history needs to go further, pointing to ways in which our own disciplines are rooted in efforts to sustain colonial encounters and how we might dismantle those assumptions. Contrary to what tales of liberalism, utopianism, or liberation might have us believe, Dr. Namakkal's narrative in Unsettling Utopia captures the political experiences that were familiar to formerly colonized subjects here lived between British India and French India, India and France. Unsettling Utopia also puts these debates in a global context, drawing connections and parallels that have previously gone unnoticed, and employing vocabularies and concepts associated with decolonization that are immensely generative. In short, this is a must-read book. To begin with, I just wanted to start by saying that it's easy for us to forget just how variegated the structures of governance were in the Indian subcontinent. We often think about it from the perspective of, the 500 odd princely states that were merged into the Indian Union. But as Unsettling Utopia shows, this is, far more complex and sort of disaggregated and unevenly mapped territory. But what the book also shows is that it also shows why it's important that we adopt that perspective. As the book shows, like the merger of more than 500 princely states in the years following political independence in 1947, the question of whether people could continue being French surrounded by India was key to their future. And here I was thinking of what the closest parallel would be if you were to take a princely state. And I really was thinking of Travancore because it's sort of, surrounded by British India, but also kind of bordering the sea. But also quite undecided in terms of whether they wanted to join the Union or not. So that's sort of the closest parallel I was thinking about. But unlike the princely states question, the alternative to Indian citizenship was probably not clear between the years of 1947 and 62 when the Treaty of Cession was signed between India and France. I was particularly struck by the fantastic discussion of Jason Korn's Sensitive Spaces, a historical ethnography of the India-Bangladesh enclaves, or the Chitmahals and the lives of the people there, that was not resolved until 2015. A wonderful pairing of arguments about the marginalized spaces of former empires and the lives of people negotiating its ever-present fault lines. And I love, Jeka, how you kind of bring it into conversation with these sort of a global history of enclaves, if you will, but about spaces that are in the subcontinent that really haven't been talked about in any significant way. And you sort of show how the French-Indian example is, in a sense, an antecedent to what was going on with the more contemporary crisis of enclave jurisdictions and statelessness on the India-Bangladesh question. But in describing these complex governance structures, Unsettling Utopia also deftly unpacks mobility, migration, and diaspora vis-a-vis the question of territory. There are references to the very real material infrastructure of border patrols here. Jessica not only tells us the little-known story of the fences between British and French India and how it formed a prototype for walls and fences built elsewhere in the British Empire, particularly that of the barbed wire fences on the Palestine-Trans-Jordan border in Mandate Palestine, but also looking at how this border was policed, surveilled, and enforced. And here I was thinking of Malini Sir's Jungle Passports, once again about the India-Bangladesh border, on the lived experiences of those on either side of a porous border, and wondered what it might have been to cross this border on an everyday basis. In the absence of proper passports, legitimate identity cards, affidavits, or declarations, there would have been border crossings on the basis of something akin to what she calls jungle passports, right? Lost to documentation. And your story just made me think about that. But there are also references to juridical borders that posed equally real-world challenges to the mobility of those who shared ethnic, cultural, religious, and linguistic ties to those on the other side of the fence. It is critical here to remember that many French Indians probably spoke Tamil or Telugu or Malayalam alongside French and English. There are refugees, exiles notably, Suyarbindo, foreigners, but also settlers and spiritual tourists. I found it especially thought-provoking to think about Unsettling Utopia alongside a growing body of literature on quote-unquote South Asian, as in located in South Asia, diasporas that do not focus on Indian migrants. Take, for example, the Tamils in Sri Lanka, Hindu, Christian, and Muslim, for whom the term diaspora is a complicated one. Similarly, the notion that Métis or Creole as vocabulary sits uncomfortably in the understanding of race, ethnicity, settlement, and migration in the context of French India. French Indians, as Jessica shows, require an equally nuanced treatment. Quite literally, they are the hyphen between France and India. Jessica captures the complexity of this experience in the story of Émile Apau, who chose French nationality and migrated to Paris only to be confronted with questions about his Frenchness, and eventually finding community with Sri Lankan Tamil refugees fleeing the civil war in Paris. Jessica points out the insufficiency and epistemic violence of bureaucratic categories and or humanitarian labels here, but also illustrates profoundly the discontinuities in the age of decolonization. And I really was thinking, okay, what's the sort of one notion that, that one can sort of, because it's so rich and so sort of, it's such a deep investigation. I was thinking, what is the one thing that I can, the one concept that I can sort of pull out of all of these? And I thought distance, right? Distance as a way of thinking about vis-a-vis the migrant, the mobile, the diasporic, the exilic, and the refugee identities that are just so beautifully illustrated in this in your narrative. And I thought I'd be thinking with that for a long time to come, because those genealogies are not as straightforward as we previously imagined. In Unsettling Utopia, we also see how these distinctions or these identities were produced and predicated on a fearful other. Here too, Jessica's emphasis on history in a minor key, as she calls it, on spaces that are often considered marginal to the historiography is key. So take, for example, the India-Pakistan partition, in which the other of the citizen is the refugee from territories assigned to Pakistan. But while the citizen and the refugee were deserving of protection, as Jessica notes, to some degree, in Jessica's account of French India, the other is the Gunda. I cannot tell you how delighted I was to see this word in a book after having thought with, some of these terms for a bit as a legal historian. So, the Gunda is the fearful other of nascent democracy in the subcontinent, disrupting the referendum that would have decided whether Pondicherry would join India or France. But the Gunda is not just a disruptor, it was also someone who was demonstrably disloyal. It is telling that British Indian intelligence reports do not name the Gundas, but the French Indian reports do. So the pro-merger freedom fighter Raphael Ramanaiah, or the communist leader V. Subbaiah, or the former French Indian socialist and full-time anti-colonialist beginning in 1953, Edward Gobard. The Gunda, of course, has a long and illustrious history in Indian legal history beginning in the 1920s, and continues to live on alongside the quote-unquote the refugee and quote-unquote illegal immigrant as a fearful other to democracy. So Tamil Nadu, which is adjacent to the present-day Union Territory of Puducherry or Pondicherry, for example, continues to retain a Gundas Act on the statute books, complete with provisions for anticipatory administrative detention for a year, along the lines of India's federal level national security legislation. So alongside habitual offenders, bootleggers, gamblers, and immoral traffic offenders, slum grabbers, the Gunda continues to exist in Indian legal and political imagination, blamed for their own dispossession, branded disloyal and unproductive. It is to this threatening violence, dispossession, and disenfranchisement that Unsettling Utopia sort of turns its attention to in the latter part of the book, as it points to the racialized divides of present-day Puducherry and the Tamil labor that sustains the ashram at Orville, dispossessed and without meaningful access to French citizenship. As other examples of partitions and territorial reconfiguration from across mercantilist and settler empires shows, these administrative state-led efforts are rarely benign, but necessarily based on dispossession and removal of indigenous populations. In the context of India itself, and here I'm really thinking about our roundtable on decolonization that the initiative hosted, I want to say last year. The time is just fluid. Where we were sort of thinking with marginal spaces, so the so I think we were thinking about Kashmir, or the region now referred to as Northeast India, where you could really see how mainland India harbors its own imperial ambitions. And sort of, to show that decolonization in that sense, is sort of an ongoing process that's still predicated on displacement. But here, from the perspective of French India, it offers us a different set of perspectives to think with, in that the notion of fraternity, friendship, and the resolution of disputes through diplomatic channels remain fundamental to both India and France. France, as Jayita mentioned in her opening remarks, keen to portray itself as a softer, friendlier imperial ruler in contrast to the British. And it's amazing how, all of the other imperial powers in the region seem to sort of very keen to sort of draw this contrast as well. You sort of hear a similar rhetoric about the Dutch as well, for instance. If decolonization across British and French empires began with gestures to a shared culture, friendship and family, so here I'm thinking about the terminology of the British Commonwealth or references to the family of nations or the French Union, there are defined affinities, loyalties, and choices that people were offered that are in some senses false binaries that Jessica notes a decolonial history must try to unpack. So for example, the choice that Edward Goubert or E.G. Pillay faced in having to choose between India and France, when in fact, Jessica speculates, his real sort of affinity was to the political fate of Pondicherry and its peoples. Here, perhaps we confront, as the book notes, the limits of the archive of colonizations and settlements. Discussions about self-determination and sovereignty in the age of decolonization, particularly in the context of mobility across borders, often assume this presence of states for nations, with little space, quite literally speaking, for other affects or affiliations. At the same time, as historians of race, caste, and labor, including in the Tamil context, have shown, we also grapple with sort of pre-colonial modes of oppression and dispossession, and how that sort of features in our contemporary, as we do with nationalists appropriating the language of decolonization to demand a more authentic, but really invented, hagiography of a nation state. So to bring all of this into the narrative of decolonization, not as a moment, but as a movement, to use Jessica's words, is to write histories that might seem messy, disruptive, and unsettling. I cannot think of a better formulation for the times that we write about and the times that we write in. So congratulations, Professor Namakkal, for this phenomenal book. And I'll stop there.
That's truly excellent. Thank you so much. We now pass it on to Dr. Andrew Smith. Dr. Andrew Smith is joining us from the United Kingdom, from the University of Chichester. I have already introduced you, Andrew, so the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jay. Thank you very much for the invite, and also to my fellow discussants, and also to Jessica as well for writing such a phenomenal book. I'm very grateful for the invite, and apologies for being a moment late. Unfortunately, the time difference and daylight savings foxed me, and I lost an hour somewhere in the mix. So I've come hot from talking about the aftermath of war and UNRWA in divided Germany to look at this. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out first was that in being invited to look at this book, it really took me on quite an extraordinary journey. First of all, just in encountering the book, really getting to grips with it and exploring the topic, I really lost myself in the book. And I've since gone out and listened to Jessica give her podcast interview on the New Books Network. I then went out and bought Ari Gautier's novel, The Tenai. I watched the documentary that you recommended as well. And then just today as well, I spoke to one of my colleagues in creative writing, Dr. Naomi Foyle. And she's a poet, and she talked about how she visited Oroville and gone to meditate in the central place. And it was it's just kind of wonderful finding all these new little threads and kind of understanding more and more about it. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to all of this. Now, in her discussion of Indian culinary influence on Britain, Elizabeth Butner quotes the late Foreign Secretary Robin Cook, declaring chicken tikka masala, and I quote, a true British national dish, not only because it's the most popular, but because it's a perfect illustration of the way that Britain absorbs and adapts external influences. Chicken tikka is an Indian dish. The masala sauce was added to satisfy the desire of British customers. Yet later, Butner notes and quotes the playwright and director Jatinder Verma in saying, quote, I don't think that has translated from our stomachs to our brains just yet. Now, reading through a recent article by two female scholars from Puducherry, they describe how family custom sustained French culinary practices and how the annual visit of diasporic families became a moment for embodying and celebrating this culture. This minor comparison between grand British claims of adoption and absorption and a messier sense of family inheritance in the former French India seems to signify more than just different attitudes to fusion cuisine. Those self-same Puducherry scholars also describe how the difference between French and British imperialism in India made, quote, the integration of the French culture, especially including its language, food and architecture into the colony, simple and easy, end quote. In an almost Foucauldian moment, they slip in the story of a retired Pondicherry policeman who learned to cook in the French style to satisfy his superiors during French rule, only then to continue preparing the same prestige meals for new Indian bosses after the formal end of French India. Now, those scholars focus on embodied practice, family legacies, and the abstraction of French influence into a positive aesthetic removed from formal structures of control, I think is a useful cipher for how France is remembered in Pondicherry. And that memory of a fundamentally different type of imperialism is one which is thoroughly interrogated in Jessica Namakkal's excellent book, Unsettling Utopias. The myth of French benevolence, tied to a cultural abstraction and divorced from its erstwhile violent and complex realities, is one that comes across very clearly and is skillfully disrupted throughout this discussion of the making and unmaking of French India. Now, indeed, I was struck by a point in Jessica's introduction about the ways that physical space and mental maps don't always align. Now, I thought that that point in the introduction was characteristically well handled, and I want to note at this stage how much I admired Jessica's impressive and clear-eyed ability to cut to the heart of a complex topic succinctly. Her definitional work on nations and states at the start of chapter 3, for example, is one that I will certainly return to with students as a really useful, nifty, and kind of very clear example of how to understand those concepts. Now, this point about physical space and mental maps centered around the statue of Edouard Goubert, of course, as Kalyani mentioned just moments ago, the first chief minister of Pondicherry and formerly a deputy in the French National Assembly. Now, Jessica points out the statue and the streets named after him bear something of a complex legacy, inscribed physically on the fabric of the town, but just as easily eroded with a breezy use of the term Beach Road or Nehru Market. And unlike his profile photo held by the National Assembly, which depicts Goubert in a Western suit and tie, Emmanuel Guénaud notes that Goubert's statue depicts him in the more typically Indian attire he adopted after his political conversion in 1954. Sherwani, a pair of cotton trousers, and a Gandhi-style topi. Now, this conversion, neatly marked by the costume change, was the one described by the last French governor of the territory as, quote, treason, and also part of the reason the governor felt that any dual citizenship after the French exit was a trap which could only store up trouble. And of course, Kalyani mentioned these difficulties of post-colonial citizenship that Jessica flags up so well. Now, when Jessica ruminates on Goubert's motivations and his legacy, motivations for that conversion, I feel like she describes him as, above all, a sort of municipal politician, torn between these two nation states and seeking in his shifting loyalties to do the best for Pondicherry, for the people in his local town and local area, and really this kind of community loyalty above all else. Now, in this vein, I think Namakkal conjures up really well how French India represented a space of hyphenation and hybridity, where identities were in motion, especially as they came into contact with borders. As she states in chapter 2, and I quote, while French India was not wholly French, it was not wholly Indian either. French India lay somewhere in between, end quote. Now, the way that borders were explored in this book was fascinating, and I found it really rich to see how these discussions overlapped with metropolitan debates occurring often at the same time. I was especially struck by Namakkal's report of how the term Alsatia was used in 1917 to describe Chandernagore by British colonial police, who suspected it of being a place which harboured criminals. Now, this discussion of Alsace is tantalising, and as we can see in the work of Alison Carroll, those borderlands were experienced neither as fixed lines nor blurred boundaries, but like braids that were daily unpicked and reworked afresh by the communities that lived within them. Now, in Alsace, the discussion of a potential referendum on state affiliation was poo-pooed by British allies in 1918, who worried about the result, but also, I think, revealed something of the imperial mind. And here, if you'll permit me, a quote from a Cabinet Office memo from the National Archives in 1918. And I quote, Alsace-Lorraine supplies a good example of the sort of difficulty that attends the simple application of the principle of nationality. It seems doubtful, therefore, whether self-determination in the shape of a plebiscite would give a clear majority for reunion with France. The appeal to history can be made, and is made, by both parties. No argument can be founded on race, and the argument from language is double-edged. We have to remember that the voters in a given plebiscite are not infallible judges of the essential spirit of a people, or the character of their enduring ideals. Some good judges tell me that I am wrong to doubt the results of plebiscites, that if a brief period, say 6 months, were given before a vote was taken, so that the ancient dwellers in those provinces could return, the verdict of the voters would be overwhelmingly French. This may be so, but I would not risk it. End quote. Now, I hope you forgive me that long quote, but it struck me as so germane to the discussions of the referenda which take place from 1948 in French India that I thought it was remarkable. That discussion of returning voters in old provinces echoes Namakkal's account of the Gunda Raj, as Kalyani mentioned as well, which is covered so well in chapter 3. And I thought this was also an excellent example of the hyphenation, the perspective, and the fluid identities, and notably the story of Raphael Ramanaya Dadala, who left the Pondicherry police, jumped the border, and set out to support refugees from French India, apparently driven by his knowledge of French history and claiming inspiration from Joan of Arc, the French Revolution, and even the Free French during the Second World War. Now, as a result, despite his own descriptions, as Namakkal describes, of threats from Gundas and rowdies, his work led him to fight against the French Indian police. And those same authorities then viewed himself as a Gunda. I thought that idea of that shifting perspective was really palpable. Also, chapter 3's coverage of the incident at Suramangalam, with its loose stone borderline marked down the centre of a village street, was a perfect example of how borders are experienced. And of course, Jessica described pro-Indian protesters gathered on the edge of this line to shout slogans. And I thought it was really tantalizing to see how their words were crossing this border, which their bodies were physically forbidden to do. Now, around 1954, as debate raged about France ceding control, Namakkal states, and I quote, "The French Indian territories, as symbols of France's lost empire in South Asia, were, like Alsace and Lorraine, depicted as integral to French national identity." End quote. Now, speaking in the National Assembly on the 10th of August 1954, Michel Rangard, an RPF deputy from Nantes, lamented the French decision to bow to pressure on her Indian presence. To applause from the right and extreme right, he recalled with great melancholy, he said, the declarations of the Indian delegate to the Constituent Assembly in Algiers in 1944, in front of 2,000 volunteers from India and Indochina, which demonstrated the links, quote, which united us and which cannot be broken. Now, for many, retreat from the établissement was indeed the start of a chain being broken, from the loss of Chandernagore in 1949 to the end of the French Union, as Kate Marsh argues so convincingly. Yet here too, as Namakkal's introduction reminds us, history is not memory, nor were melancholic reflections and recollections a substitute for imperial reform. Now, as his biography on the National Assembly website recalls, that delegate in 1944, Deva Sivaratanam, was born in Pondicherry and trained there as a lawyer. And his speech on the 14th of January 1944 contained all the relevant platitudes about India's commitment to the French cause, attuned to the discussions of Franco-Indian friendship, we hear described by what Namakkal has elsewhere termed nostalgic colonialism. But Sivaratanam's 1944 speech also included notes of critique. And I quote, "the need for reforms and the establishment of direct universal suffrage without distinction in order to eliminate inequity." End quote. Now, those weren't the signs of a utopic relationship or a benign imperial rule. Now, back in the Assembly in 1954, Rangard summarised what he understood of French efforts in Pondicherry, listing the schools built and the well-stocked library that France had put in place. And I quote, "No, my dear colleagues, the cause we are advocating for in India is not tainted by sordid interests. It is above all a matter of the freedom of the peoples to whom we have been able to give the benefit of our culture and our civilization." End quote. He also cited, of course, Gandhi's description of France as, and I quote, "a great friend of liberty." End quote. Again, however, actual representatives of French India recognised a gap between rhetoric and reality, with Sivaratanam denouncing in March 1946 the, quote, "gap between metropolitan France, where democracy is not an empty word, and practices in French India, where thanks to the governor and his auxiliaries, there's no such democracy, no freedom, even less equality. One might think that the great and beautiful country that is France is sending us officials who are concerned to make its true figure unrecognisable." End quote. Now, that gap between the imagined past of cosy colonial relationships and the realities of complex and often fraught tension is exactly the sort of disruption that Namakkal's book achieves, I think. Now, it turns out that Sivaratanam lost his seat only 3 months after that speech in the after that speech he gave there that I reported in the June 1946 elections. And that's an election in which Sivaratanam received a measly 18 votes, 1-8. I was fascinated by that turnaround. How did a man who won over 22,000 votes in the elections of October 1945 shed almost every single one of them only 8 months later in June 1946? Well, as Namakkal tells us, Lambert Saravan, who succeeded him in the assembly, was a member of the newly formed National Democratic Front. As we find out, a political constellation created by alliances between French Indian groups keen to take advantage of colonial reform and, in the words of Achille Yeturi, better influence the course of their history. Now, the National Democratic Front, like the Fourth Republic Constitution, which allowed it to find representation, had its roots in the Second World War. And as we find out in chapters 2 and 3 of Namakkal's work, the communist V. Subbiah, as Kalyani mentioned as well, was instrumental to that movement. And in his release from British jail in Vellore Central in September 42, he launched the Communist Party of French India and was later part of the combat movement of French Indians against fascism. As Achille Yeturi notes in her article on the myths and realities of resistance to French India, that movement grew from 1943 as Emmanuel Adessiam, a French Indian history teacher at the Lycée d'Oran in Algeria, came as an emissary from the Algiers government in exile to spread propaganda and recruit support for the Free French in Pondicherry. His appointment of V. Subbiah to a key role in this movement displeased the French governor and saw some criticize combat of, quote, playing politics by including such agitators. Now here we saw a good example of the three worlds of French India, which Namakkal describes in the introduction and in the conclusion as well, with the crossing of the, quote, ville blanche and ville noire, creating unease and suspicion. Subbiah's appointment detracted from the story of resistance as an activity for the French relating to France, and instead played to the political grains of French Indian mobilization. Here, as throughout, was a really strong sense, I thought, of why, as Jessica argues, minor history is not a history of the margins, but a concentrated look beyond wider categories and matrices of power at something which allows a more complex appreciation of the period of study. That French documentary on the three worlds of Pondicherry from 1964 seemed to suggest that Pondicherry was always an Indian town putting on a French costume, except for the ashram, in which it saw something more authentically French. Now, the turbulent legacy of the ashram and its Oroville offshoot, those European dreams on Tamil land, as Namakkal so deftly terms them, are an extraordinarily rich example, I think, of just those sorts of tensions. Now, the conclusion to Jessica's book, I thought, was beautifully written, conjuring up a wonderful sense of place and moment, which illustrated the themes of the book magnificently. Namakkal's description of tourists drinking cappuccinos in cafes curated for their #FranceAnd experience spoke of an afterlife for French influence, framed in the sanitized language of heritage town. Yet again, however, I would return to the article on Puducherry cuisine, which I mentioned at the start, which describes, and I quote, how the French restaurants in Puducherry are a combination of promiscuity and privacy, effectively isolating the individual or small group, end quote. Now that culinary world, whether a beachfront cappuccino or a Tamil take on coq au vin, conjures up images of hyphenation, as mentioned earlier. But it also opens up moments and opportunities for the disruption for which Namakkal aims, in which we might revere the minor history as a way of enriching our wider sense of people whose experiences of place can be defined by the borders that divide them. But, as this book reminds us, those experiences can also transcend, outlive, and shape those self-same borderlines, often marked and represented by little more than stones in the middle of the road. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm just going to move this. Fabulous. So as I had mentioned to the panelists, I'm going to keep my questions very short because I'd like you folks to interact among each other, and we do have an audience. A lot of people are also waiting for a recording, just so you know. So there was a high demand for your book talk. So I really enjoyed reading your book, Jayita. I'm a big fan of your work. I have been following your work even with the journal articles, and I have heavily cited your work in my chapters on the French dimension in my book that's coming out. So I found this book, found it both delightful and empowering at the same time. And it's hard to find a book that it's doing both at the same time and doing it just the right amount equally. Unsettling Utopia bravely paves the path for future scholarship on decolonization and decolonial histories by challenging previously held notions of national identities, citizenship, subjecthood, settlers, migrants, and tourists, to name a few. This is an extremely well-researched, empirically rich study of the entangled histories of French Indians, of Frenchness, of Francité, and of Indianness in the very liminal spaces between empires and nation states. And I could go on and on with my praise for your book. So I'm going to ask three broad questions in the interest of time, because I just found there was just so much food for thought. First, Unsettling Utopia has a clear call to action to decolonize histories by really disentangling decolonization from being a moment in time, a moment in the 40s, 50s, 60s, when new nation states emerged. And as we do that, and as you could say, it's a question to all of you. As we do that, how do we as scholars situate territoriality and spatiality in these decolonial histories going forward in terms of our choice of methods and sources? And you have done that in your own way. And I know Kalyani's work, she also does it in her own ways. And Andrew, you might also have some thoughts on that. And this also ties to the theme of the Decolonization-in-Progress seminar, where we are obsessed this academic year with territoriality. So that was my first question. Second is, I really liked it really struck a chord with me, your mention about the racialized disenfranchisement of the banlieues of France during your visit in 2009 in Paris. And I was actually doing my master's in sociology during that academic year. And my topic was the colonial character of urban violence in France. It didn't go very well. I did finish it, but I got some pushback that there was nothing called post-colonial France, for example. So all your criticism of we need critical studies of the French Empire, I completely believe you, having experienced some of that resistance firsthand. So I'm very aware of the political debates of the French national identity centering on immigration, les sans-papiers, the heavy policing of the banlieues. And so my question is, how do we more effectively study the connected histories of decolonization from the comptoir français d'Hollande to the 10th or the 18th arrondissement of Paris? You do signal that to the very end. I think that's just beautiful and so important. So some thoughts on that going forward in terms of scholarship for us as scholars who are interested in these topics. Third and finally, I really like your inquiry about utopian settler colonialism. And I was wondering, as you conducted this research, do you find entanglements of various kinds or parallel, similar, different? I'm not quite sure what to say, but I'm wondering if you found any similar entanglements with other cosmopolitan religious centers in India with a strong white settler presence. And I'm thinking about, the ISKCON headquartered in West Bengal, Mayapur. I'm thinking about Missionaries of Charity, for example, in Calcutta. I hope nobody gets mad at me for saying that. So I'm wondering if there is a conceptual architecture that we could derive from your book and then employ that to make sense of the 20th century global spiritual networks in South Asia or perhaps other places of the world that have a very complex racialized hierarchies. And it's very difficult to understand them without utopian settler colonialism. So once again, thank you for an excellent book. And I look forward to comments, questions, and interventions.
Thank you, everyone. This is truly, my mind is blown. These are such fantastic, rich, productive, generative comments. I will send you all a giant IOU for many drinks when we can see each other at some point. I'm just truly flattered. This is, all of these comments have raised so much. Maybe I'll start with Jay's questions because they were, because you just said them, and we can go from there. And I'm not going to take a lot of time to do this, but I'll start from the last, which just because that's my next project is really getting into this more. I'm sort of working from the title, Utopianism has a settler colonial problem. And thinking about this globally, not just within India, the ISKCON is a good question. I think that falls more into this category, but I think with the mission, the missionaries they have their own history. Do you know, I mean, it's they're seen as related, directly related to major world religions, right? They're not seen as sort of these offshoots. I mean, the thing about an Oroville and Aurobindo and the Mother is they explicitly say over and over again, we're not a religion, right? So like, how could we be religious missionaries? Where, you know, we're not a religion. We believe in some ethereal thing called the divine consciousness, right? And it's sort of open for whoever wants to meditate on it. Although then we see how there's all these exclusions built in to who can meditate on it. But I think, you know, ISKCON, I think there's a lot of, and that really is a global movement. That's something that started really outside of India and comes back to it, right? So I think, and also Rishikesh, you know, I mean, I think there's a lot to look at there. One thing I've actually been interested in is thinking about Chandigarh, the Utopian project, in relationship to Oroville. And if I could do research in Chandigarh, I don't know if they'll ever let me go there actually, but because of citizenship reasons. But I think that would actually be a really interesting parallel case to think about sort of the moment of independence and utopian thinking in non-spiritual ways, but in more socialist visions. So that's one thing. Yeah, I mean, the decolonized history thing, I'm glad people picked up on that, I get, or found it interesting. You know, that's something I struggle with because obviously it's, you know, it's something that I believe is necessary. I also think it's a hard question to answer and not one I think I did in this book. You know, I took my shot at what I thought would be an ethical approach to talking about these archives and these borders. And, you know, part of it is just making things apparent that aren't, right? Just bringing visibility to structures that are often considered organic and natural, to take what people see as something of a historical curiosity and interrogating what's actually going on there. But I would actually love to hear what you all think about what it means to decolonize disciplines. I mean, I have a job in an institution, right? I'm here right now. You know, I'm on stolen land. You know, there's, you know, I'm producing knowledge. You know, I wrote this book in the, I don't know, you guys can tell me how historical you think it actually is, but sometimes I speak to historians, sometimes not, you know, but you know, it was, you know, for within a career trajectory. So there's all kinds of things I did that I think play into reinscribing colonial categories. But again, I guess I'm thinking about making things apparent as a way to disrupt. And maybe that answers your question number two a little bit, you know, and maybe Andrew can speak to this as someone who maybe works in contemporary France or within the hexagon more than I do. But yeah, you know, just even talking about what post-colonialism might mean in the French sense, right? You know, and not in a way that's Anglo-centric. I mean, obviously my book is written in English, but I think that's been part of the problem. And again, maybe Andrew can speak to this as someone who might know a little more about this, but part of the problem is that, you know, post-colonial studies is an Anglo field. You know, this was part of my disruption is to think about India through a French lens, right? And decenter the Anglo thing a little bit. But you know, how does that speak to, I don't know, have you all seen this list going around on Twitter this week? Andrew, did you see this? I can't remember who wrote it. There's a list, like a white guy French historian made a list of the 5 books that he would suggest. You know, one of them is Heart of Darkness to like teach Europeans about Africa or something. You know, so I think it's really present both in Anglo-centric French studies still, about who produces knowledge and about what, right, and what should be taken seriously there. So I think that, you know, in some fields it feels like, oh, we already addressed that, but disciplines don't really speak to each other all that much, actually, right? So something that maybe people are doing in American studies isn't translating into, you know, South Asian studies or French studies. You know, so I think I'm trying to sort of speak across what I see as disciplines that are trying to do that political work a little bit. But anyway, yeah. I just want to say it was really such a delight to hear from like a real South Asianist perspective from Kalyani, and then the sort of French perspective from Andrew, because I started in my PhD in French history and then sort of went to South Asia. So I really straddle that line in a lot of ways. And like, I'm unwilling to fully plant myself in either. And maybe that just makes me a little wishy-washy, but anyway, but it's so nice to hear how it speaks to the different fields. But I am curious, from everyone here, is there a way to bring these discussions together in a way that sort of affects the fields, right? I mean, in the book, I make this minor space less minor, I think, but like, how does that translate into a French studies or a South Asian studies, right? Or is it just like part of the oddities? I don't know, something to think about.
Andrew, do you want to share your thoughts? I know I'm confident Kalyani has a lot of things to say, because we have had these conversations about with the decolonization events, but on the French side of things, or about critical studies of the empire that could perhaps speak to the kind of scholarship that Jayita has produced and she will produce, and scholars like her and others. I would love to revisit colonial roots of urban violence, that thesis of mine at some point, for example. So what exactly are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to Jessica as well. I think I'm only so qualified to talk on it, just as someone who's sort of active in the area more than anything else, than an authority on it, I think. But I find it interesting, that list you mentioned, Jessica, so and some people criticizing it, because it is just one of these things that replicates a certain structure and hierarchy of order of knowledge creation. There are sort of hollow ways, I think, that we can, and institutions have sort of co-opted in some ways that language of decolonization, about saying, it just involves citing more people and X, Y, Z, and revisiting a reading list. I think it is more about engaging and prioritizing different voices, about trying to find different structures to support. I think one of the ways I think I link that to one of the things you talked about in terms of like reconstituting archives and trying to piece together those archives is ideas of like civil society. I'm always I don't know, someone asked me recently, one of my students in a class on political ideas asked me about my own kind of political how do you define yourself politically? It's a horrible thing to ask, isn't it? How you trying to figure out how you do it. I kind of put myself somewhere between like Gordon Brown and Michel Rocard in the kind of first instance, about kind of like weird ideas that I think civil society is incredibly important, about how we understand and reshape the political in that big sense, that Claude Lefort sense. And I think that's a really important idea. And I think there we can find, probably in civil society, some of the ways to reconstitute some of these stories more actively. I was struck, I heard a few years ago, Sudhir Hazavi Singh speak on his book, on his project on Toussaint, L'Ouverture. And he's kind of now obviously done his big book. He won the Wolfson. It was amazing. It's a wonderful book. But when he spoke about it at the time, he talked about trying to reconstitute this sort of distributed archive, trying to piece together these ideas. I would think also of one of my colleagues, and one of the people that first kind of mentioned Pondicherry to me, is the wonderful Margot Finn at UCL, and she's worked a lot on the East India Company, and she's got a great project on the East India Company at home, and talks about those kind of influences of culture and about this transference and all the rest of it. And she really has been keen to try and find different ways to interrogate those structures. I think what Jessica talked about really well was about kind of disruption, about kind of like looking askance, and that's there. I thought that model of the kind of the minor histories is one that is so powerful, because I mean, naturally, I'm somebody that's kind of a bit of a, even within metropolitan France, a kind of sudiste, as it were. I've always wanted to study the Languedoc and look at the kind of the periphery and the ideas of challenges to Paris. And there they consistently use this language of internal colonialism. Now, at times that's really ropey and super appropriates other people's struggles. There are ways in which like some of the economic relationships are kind of framed in similar, but I mean, largely we're talking about the appropriation of that language of struggle, because it seems like a kind of form of solidarity. But there are also weird movements of solidarity that I think are worth recovering at that moment. My current project I'm working on is about the Larzac. And all the stuff I've seen in the Larzac so far tends to be either first of all, either written by people that are so enmeshed in the movement, it's like micro level, just about the kind of the, you know, the local things, or it's so airy fairy. It's the kind of stuff where you see those histories of Oroville written by residents that are just like, it's the best, I love it, you know, it's, you know, all this kind of stuff. And actually, it strikes me as really interesting because you can find all these networks of solidarity. So just the other day, when I'm looking into stuff after reading Jessica's book and trying to like research stuff in terms of writing all this, I started to then find people. A guy that went from the Larzac in '72 straight to Oroville to do work on the actual construction. Started to find all these different connections. Of course, done lots on Lazaro Basta and the idea of the community of the ark and about these different ideas of relationships to Gandhiism. Then looking at the way that relates to networks like the Fellowship of Reconciliation and international pacifist movements and how they connect across different continents, and how actually when I'm reconstituting those structures, it's kind of following the, I guess, the veins of those civil society organizations, not states, not organizations, not power structures, but almost the kind of retracing the steps of these minor histories of kind of well-meaning people that wanted to do nice things and help out and kind of show solidarity in a meaningful way. And one of the coolest things I found just recently in the Larzac is about people that went from the Larzac to Upper Volta, then Burkina Faso, to try and kind of invest in like drought relief funds. And these guys got it in a different way than just saying like, you know, right on, we love it. But it actually was about reforging and forging meaningful bonds of solidarity, which allowed people, in that case, they called it peasant. They didn't use the term peasant loosely. It was an identity term. They talked about peasant to peasant learning, about new structures of knowledge, disrupting all those hierarchies they met before. That doesn't make it unproblematic. That doesn't make it, you know, all fine. And we don't want to tell some rosy story that was the kind of the way of things to come. But I think the kind of work that Jessica does, retelling those stories, reconstituting those archives, tracing those civil society movements, and kind of, you know, collating, repiecing together, you know, re-finding their archives, which are so distributed, as you point out, and you talk in the I think really well in your kind of prologue, I think it is, you know, about all the different places you've been in terms of trying to retrace that, and I think it's extraordinary, and that I think is such a valuable lesson. I think one of the key lessons is that personally, and again, it's a controversial thing always to say in the UK, is I don't think you can write really great history if you only speak English. That's a controversial thing to say because, of course, it refers to class, it refers to access to language learning, but I think that also speaks to the way that, you know, languages are valued. I think it's important to look at multiple perspectives, important to look at multiple archives, important to consider multiple voices. And that, I think, is one of the things that we can hope that the process of decolonization, rather than the event of it, is, I hope, part of that structure. But yeah, I want to say again, just to congratulate Jessica on what I think really moves towards that type of praxis, as well as anything else. I think some really interesting models, which I know that I will certainly you know, reference in my own work in terms of really valuable insights into some of those ideas. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. I know I don't want to hear from Cal. I want to say one thing, and while you were talking, this made me think of one other sort of insight I had, where I had to push back against my own desires, which is, you know, as somebody who's interested in decolonization and, you know, solidarity movements and, you know, third world liberation, all of these things that I might find inspiring in radical politics, you know, I had to sort of realize, you know, my subjects aren't going to be the radicals I want them to be. That doesn't mean I shouldn't interrogate them and talk about them. But, and this is, you know, when I talked about the mother and Aurobindo being colonial and anti-colonial, at the same time, these overlapping, what seem to be contrasting identities are held in tension so often. Right. And so what I've really had to do, and I have found, I'm teaching a decolonization class right now, and I have to keep reminding my students, you know, when you do the Berlin conference, when you do, you know, all of these big meetings of white men, European imperialists, right? You have to say, like, you actually can't be cynical about their intentions. Right. You have to understand that they believe what they believe. And it just as Andrew was just saying, it's not that it's not problematic, but, you know, us seeing the problems with it doesn't mean that when they are saying, I think this is a civilizing mission, and I truly believe we're bringing good to people, you know, sometimes you can see how maybe they knew that wasn't true, but a lot of times they like really bought it. Right. So what do you do as a historian when you're like, I know how terrible this is? You know, but also I have to sort of believe that they believed it to a certain extent, even, you know, unless you have a document that says, like, you know, we're fleecing everyone right now. right? It's like, oh, you know, most often they just didn't care about the things we might care about, right? But it is, you know, what do you do when you, these categories of analysis we use? What if, you know, they contrast in the same person? Like, what do we do with that, right? And I think that's true of a lot of Indians in the independence movement, like a lot, you know. So this sort of radical language around decolonization that really comes sort of post the Wretched of the Earth, right? Like we can't go and apply it to this sense. So, you know, how can we take sort of those ideas, but you know, and do this sort of work within the discipline, but also look at what actually happened is, anyway.
Kalyani, I will give you the last word. We have 5 minutes and we absolutely must hear from you.
Thanks, no pressure, friends. But you know, Jayita, thank you. I mean, and Jay for the question, and Andrew for, you know, those comments which I couldn't agree with more. You know, my 2 cents on this, particularly since you asked about how it might translate to somebody. I mean, I myself have interdisciplinary training. So, you know, one of the things as a legal historian and also somebody who studies South Asian history, and one of the things I've absolutely refused to do, and which, you know, is commit to one or the other. And I love, as you do, Jayita, you know, kind of walking that tightrope. And I think that's what makes for productive generative scholarship. And I mean, if there's one thing we can all do is to refuse to commit to either, you know, one or the other. The other thing particularly, and that in some ways it opens up spaces for more people for, you know, to sort of gather around the table. We're just going to get more people interested in our writing and in our conversations. So in that sense, I think of it as being, you know, in that sense more inclusive. But the other point I wanted to make, really, and this is from the perspective of South Asian studies / South Asian history, is that, you know, it's just beginning to come out of that sort of area studies paradigm in and sort of, you know, what is recognizably South Asian history. And I, you know, as somebody who came to it from a different kind of training, I've always been sort of like confused by it, that there is only one sort of history that is seen to be South Asian history. And, you know, sort of how I think we can get at it a little more, still continue to push the boundaries, but also sort of speak to some of the debates, is to really pay attention to the notion of place, in which you do so beautifully. And I think, you know, in that sense, we are, you know, as scholars interested in decolonization, we are well placed to kind of tackle that notion of place. What does it mean to write from that location? Where do we sit vis-a-vis those locations? All of these things that are beautifully explored in your book. I really don't, you know, I couldn't agree with any of that anymore, because, and to then see how that plays out. So for instance, and this might start with the very, you know, the, you know, archival work or field work, that you don't just go to assembled archives, but you kind of start from the place itself with the languages that are spoken there, and then kind of scale up. And then I think, you know, not to sort of have, in a sense, an ethnography of the place, but to really then say, okay, what other histories or what other accounts arise? What other categories and concepts are being used by these people in these places? So then we can completely sort of, in some senses, narrate something different, a history in a minor key, a messy, of disruptive history that in some ways, you know, surprises us with the connections. Might not have surprised our historical actors, was certainly surprising to the reader, to our fellow interlocutors, but also kind of plays with the notion of scale, but isn't really just an account of, look, here's the past and it was a foreign place. So it's really in that notion of placemaking and habitation that I find the most comfort, in that, you know, I am really speaking to people who do recognizable South Asian history, but also in some senses, I would like to bring my own perspectives to it. I mean, that said, this book, I think, is already in conversation with an amazing, growing, lively set of works on South Asian history. And I think particularly thinking forwards to your new project in terms of settler utopianism, I think there's this narrative of post-47 South Asia as kind of grounded in notions of development. And I think this is a really, really interesting spin on that notion. I think, Ben was here earlier and could have spoken to it. But, I do think that, suddenly you have the 47 moment where it's all about displacement and so on. And then post-47, as you get into fields that political scientists and anthropologists have kind of explored in greater detail, you kind of see that notion of development, the historiography kind of taking over there. Now there's much more critical work being done on that notion, including from my colleagues at Princeton, but that's where I think you really do come at it with this kind of disruptive history. And I think it's so exciting to see that. And of course, in the past few years, we've also talked a great deal about what this means for notions of political belonging and citizenship. And I think we have a growing number of colleagues who are sort of interested in that notion, because more than ever before, that sort of notion is under attack in South Asia. So it is of great political urgency as well that we continue to tell these messy, disruptive, but really nuanced and complex histories.
And that actually, thank you so much. And I know this is the last, I'm not supposed to have the last word. It was supposed to be Cal, but I want to say,
it's you.
You have the last word.
I think what you just said about, understanding how these concepts of, these citizenship categories are contested. I think it's the same in France. This it's not the same, but it's similar, right? Especially around France's relationship to their post-colonial citizens.